The first report did not mention possession. It mentioned dust. According to a handwritten inventory log dated March 12, 2011, a small collection of Near Eastern artifacts arrived at a private restoration studio outside Leipzig. The items were described as ceremonial fragments recovered from an unregistered excavation site near the Tigris Basin. Stone, bronze, and fired clay. All incomplete. All damaged. One entry was marked differently. No catalog number. No measurements. Only a note written in tighter script than the rest. Handled last. Seal container immediately. The technician who signed that page, Matthias Keller, would later tell investigators that he noticed the dust before he noticed anything else. It was not the fine gray powder common to old clay. It was darker. Almost oily. It clung to the gloves and left smears on stainless steel. When he wiped it away, it returned within minutes, collecting along the edges of the crate as if drawn there. The crate itself had no markings. No customs seal. No sender information. Only a faded strip of red cloth tied around the latch. Inside were 3 fragments. A broken relief slab depicting a winged figure. A bronze amulet with corroded inscriptions. And a small clay head, no larger than a fist, its features eroded but unmistakably intentional. Hollow eyes. An elongated mouth. Traces of black resin pooled in the creases. Matthias did not touch the head at first. He later said he felt watched by it, though he admitted that sounded foolish even as he said it. He photographed the items, logged their condition, and placed the head back into the crate. That night, the security system recorded movement in the studio at 2:17 a.m. No doors opened. No alarms triggered. Only a single interior camera showed the crate lid lifting slightly, then settling back down. When Matthias returned the next morning, the dust was gone. In its place were footprints. They were small, bare, pressed into the thin layer of packing sand on the floor. They began at the crate and ended at the wall. There were no prints leading away. Within a week, Matthias complained of headaches and auditory disturbances. He described a low pressure behind his eyes and a sensation of heat in his ears. A physician diagnosed stress and dehydration. Blood tests showed nothing unusual. He was advised to rest. He did not rest. Coworkers noticed changes. He stopped eating during lunch breaks. He spoke less, then more, often muttering to himself in a language no one recognized. Audio recordings from the studio picked up fragments of these monologues. Linguists later identified elements consistent with Akkadian phonemes, though the structure was degraded and repetitive. On April 2nd, Matthias was found standing in the restoration bay after hours, lights off, hands pressed flat against the crate. He did not respond when addressed. When security attempted to escort him out, he resisted with unusual strength, shouting a single phrase again and again. "He is older than mankind." This incident prompted the studio director to contact the artifact broker responsible for the delivery. The broker denied knowledge of the items. No invoices existed. No transfer records. The director then contacted a regional museum curator with experience in Mesopotamian material. The curator arrived 2 days later and immediately requested that the clay head be removed from the premises. According to her statement, the object did not match known museum-held representations. It bore similarities to apotropaic figures associated with ancient protective rites, but its proportions were wrong. The mouth was too wide. The eye sockets too deep. The interior cavity was coated with resin mixed with human ash. Carbon dating later placed the clay itself between the 7th and 8th century BC. The resin was significantly younger. The curator recommended ecclesiastical consultation. This recommendation was not based on superstition. It was based on precedent. Church records from the Diocese of Magdeburg include a memorandum dated April 9, 2011. It notes a request for assessment regarding possible psychological disturbance associated with exposure to antiquities containing ritual contamination. The memorandum was forwarded to Father Elias Kruger, a priest trained in pastoral counseling and assigned to cases involving alleged spiritual affliction. Father Kruger visited the studio on April 11th. He later stated that upon entering the restoration bay, he experienced a sudden drop in temperature and a sensation of vertigo. Environmental readings taken later did not support a temperature change. The sensation remained unexplained. Matthias was present during the visit. He sat in a chair facing the crate, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow. When Father Kruger introduced himself, Matthias smiled. Witnesses reported that the smile did not reach his eyes. The priest began with standard pastoral dialogue. He asked Matthias about sleep, stress, and recent events. Matthias answered politely at first.
His voice was calm. Too calm.
When asked about the artifacts, he paused, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "They are fragments of a gate," he said. "Not a door. A marker. A warning." Father Kruger asked him to explain. Matthias tilted his head and closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. The cadence was slower. Each word was separated by a breath. "He was bound before your kind learned to bury the dead. Bound not by chains, but by forgetting. These pieces remember." The curator attempted to intervene, suggesting the conversation end. Matthias began to laugh. The sound echoed unnaturally in the room, rising and falling without rhythm. Father Kruger later wrote that this was the moment he felt certain the case required escalation. Matthias was admitted to a psychiatric facility that evening. The artifacts were sealed and transferred to a secure storage room in the studio basement. Within hours of Matthias's admission, hospital staff reported disturbances. Lights flickered. Monitoring equipment malfunctioned. Matthias refused food and water. He lay still for long periods, then suddenly sat upright and began reciting phrases in a voice that did not match his own. Audio recordings from the ward captured one clear sentence. "I was old when the first fire was stolen." Medical explanations were pursued aggressively. Neurological scans showed no lesions. Toxicology screens were negative. Antipsychotic medication had no effect. Sedatives lowered his heart rate, but did not induce sleep. Nurses reported that when they approached his bed, they felt sudden waves of nausea and dread. On April 14th, Matthias suffered a seizure. During the event, 3 staff members reported hearing a deep vocalization that did not correspond to any visible source. The sound was later described as layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. After the seizure, Matthias opened his eyes and spoke clearly. "Bring the man who wears the dead god's collar." Father Kruger was contacted that night. The diocese authorized a formal evaluation under the church's guidelines for extraordinary spiritual phenomena. This was not an exorcism. It was an assessment. 2 priests were assigned. A medical professional was present. The goal was discernment. The assessment took place in a private room at the hospital. The artifacts were not present. This absence did not appear to matter. When Father Kruger entered, Matthias began to hum. The melody did not correspond to any known hymn. It was low and repetitive, vibrating in the chest. The medical professional noted an increase in ambient electromagnetic interference during this period. The cause was not identified. Father Kruger began with prayers spoken quietly. Matthias responded immediately, not with resistance, but with amusement. "That hum was young when I learned it," he said. "It tasted of blood and smoke then. It still does." The priests asked him to identify himself. "I am not what you name," the voice replied. "Names are tools. I am what remained when the first ones learned fear." When asked why it spoke through Matthias, the voice paused. "He opened the vessel," it said. "He listened. He remembered." At this point, Matthias's body exhibited signs of severe strain. Veins darkened beneath the skin of his neck. His breathing became irregular. The medical professional recommended termination of the session. Father Kruger agreed. As they stood to leave, Matthias's eyes locked onto the priest's collar. His lips moved silently. Then he spoke one final sentence. "The fragments are calling the rest." That same night, the studio's basement storage alarm was triggered. Security footage showed the sealed container vibrating. The red cloth tied around the latch unraveled on its own and fell to the floor. Inside, the clay head had cracked down the center, splitting cleanly as if pressed from within. When staff arrived, they found the interior cavity empty. No fragments were found. No dust. Only a thin smear of black resin leading away from the container, across the concrete floor, and toward the stairwell. It stopped at the bottom step. The resin trail was still wet when security arrived. It reflected the emergency lights in dull streaks, like oil on water. No one could explain how it had moved uphill against gravity or why it ended so precisely at the stair's edge, as if something had paused there and decided not to continue. By morning, the resin had hardened into a brittle black film. Samples were collected and sent for analysis. The results would arrive weeks later and raise more questions than answers. The compound was organic, but its molecular structure did not match any known resin used in ancient rituals. Mixed into it were traces of human DNA, degraded beyond identification, and a high concentration of iron oxide, consistent with long-term exposure to blood. The studio was closed indefinitely. Father Kruger returned to the hospital the following day. Matthias had been restrained overnight after attempting to remove his own fingernails with his teeth. When asked why, he reportedly said they were written on and needed to be erased. His fingers were wrapped in gauze stained dark with blood, yet he showed no signs of pain. During the second assessment, Matthias did not speak at first. He stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently. The priests began prayers again, slower this time, careful with their words. The room felt heavy. Several witnesses later described a sensation like standing underwater, pressure against the chest, sound distorted. When Matthias finally spoke, it was not in response to prayer.
"They broke the seal wrong," he said.
"They always do." Father Kruger asked him what seal he meant. "The one that keeps memory asleep," the voice replied. "Stone forgets. Clay forgets. But blood remembers." The priests attempted to identify the entity using established rites. They asked direct questions, invoking authority, demanding clarity. The voice laughed, a short sound that ended abruptly, as if cut off. "You think age makes you small," it said. "You think old things crumble. I was old when you learned to count the years." Father Kruger noted that during this exchange, Matthias's pupils were fully dilated, irises barely visible. His heart rate remained steady. There was no sign of panic or confusion. The voice was controlled, deliberate. The session ended when Matthias's restraints began to strain against the bed frame. Metal bolts loosened. A nurse screamed. The medical professional ordered sedation. It took 3 doses to subdue him. That evening, Father Kruger contacted a specialist. According to diocesan records, only 3 priests in the region were authorized to perform a full rite of exorcism. One was elderly and infirm. One was overseas. The third was Father Anton Weiss. Father Weiss had been ordained for over 40 years. His name appeared in several sealed church documents related to unresolved possession cases. He did not seek publicity. He did not give interviews. When contacted, he asked only one question: "Are there objects involved?" Father Kruger answered honestly, "Yes." Father Weiss agreed to come. Before his arrival, the curator who had first examined the artifacts sent an urgent message. She had been reviewing photographs of the clay head and the relief slab. Beneath layers of erosion, she identified a recurring symbol carved into the stone fragments. It was not decorative. It was functional. The symbol represented binding. In ancient Mesopotamian belief, certain entities were not expelled but confined. They were given names not to summon them, but to trap them. Their representations were buried at thresholds, crossroads, riverbanks. Not worshipped. Imprisoned. One name appeared repeatedly in fragmented texts associated with these practices. A name later misinterpreted, demonized, mythologized. Pazuzu. The curator emphasized that this was not a simple demon figure. In its original context, Pazuzu was invoked to ward off greater evils. A force used to counterbalance others. Dangerous but controlled. The artifacts found near the Tigris were not devotional. They were containment markers. Someone somewhere had dug them up. Father Weiss arrived on April 17th. Witnesses described him as unremarkable. Thin, stooped, gray-haired. His voice was quiet. His eyes were not. He requested to see Matthias alone before any ritual preparations. The hospital reluctantly agreed, insisting on observation through reinforced glass. The moment Father Weiss entered the room, Matthias began to shake. Not violently, subtly. A tremor running through his limbs, like a current finding ground. Father Weiss did not speak at first. He sat in a chair, placed his hands on his knees, and watched. Minutes passed. Then Matthias smiled. "You smell of old books," the voice said. "And fear." Father Weiss nodded once. "You are not welcome here," he replied. The voice's smile widened. "I was here before your words learned shape." Father Weiss leaned forward. "You are bound," he said. "You were bound once. You can be bound again." At this, Matthias screamed. The sound was raw, human, filled with pain. It lasted several seconds, then stopped abruptly. When Matthias looked up again, tears streamed down his face. "It hurts," he whispered, his own voice, fragile. "It won't let me sleep." Father Weiss stood. "It fears sleep," he said quietly. "That tells us much." Preparations for a full exorcism began immediately. The church insisted on strict protocol, medical supervision, psychological evaluation, written consent from next of kin. The hospital required additional safeguards. The room was cleared of loose objects. Windows were sealed. Electrical equipment was grounded. Father Weiss requested one unusual condition. He asked that the remaining artifacts be brought to the hospital. The studio director objected. The curator warned against it. Father Weiss was firm. "It is anchored to them," he said, "and they're calling it home." The artifacts arrived in sealed containers under police escort. When they were brought into the hospital wing, multiple electronic systems failed simultaneously. Backup generators activated. Security cameras glitched, showing static interspersed with brief images that did not correspond to reality. One frame, later recovered, showed the clay head intact, staring directly into the lens. The exorcism began at 11:43 p.m. Father Weiss stood at the foot of the bed. Father Kruger assisted. A physician monitored Matthias's vitals. 2 nurses remained near the door. The artifacts were placed on a table covered in white cloth. The prayers began. At first, there was silence. Matthias lay still, eyes closed, breathing slow. The room felt cold. Frost formed on the edges of the window seals despite functioning climate control. When Father Weiss invoked authority, Matthias's body arched. The voice returned, louder now, layered, resonant. "You call me by a mask," it said. "You think the name binds me." Father Weiss continued. The artifacts began to vibrate. The bronze amulet rattled against the table. The relief slab cracked audibly, a fracture running through the carved symbol. The cloth covering the clay had darkened as resin seeped through. Matthias screamed again. This time, the sound did not stop. Witnesses reported that the scream seemed to echo from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as if the room itself were amplifying it. Father Weiss demanded identification. The voice responded with contempt. "I was hunger when your bones were soft. I was fear when you learned to hide in caves. I taught you how to kneel." The physician shouted that Matthias's heart rate was spiking. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. His restraint strained. Father Weiss stepped closer. "You will name yourself," he commanded. For the first time, the voice hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second. But it was enough. The clay had shattered. Not outward. Inward. Imploding into fragments that collapsed into the cavity where the resin had been. A pressure wave rippled through the room, knocking equipment to the floor. Lights went out. In the darkness, something moved. Witnesses later described a shape forming above Matthias's body. Not solid. Not fully visible. A distortion in the air, like heat over asphalt. It leaned close to his face. Matthias spoke, his voice barely audible. "It says it will never go back." Father Weiss raised his voice. "You are not older than the one who made time," he said. The distortion recoiled. For the first time, the voice screamed in rage. The sound was deafening. Alarms blared. The physician shouted that Matthias was crashing. The nurses fled the room. Father Weiss continued the rite without pause. The relief slab split completely. The bronze amulet cracked, its inscription flaking away into dust. The voice began to weaken, its words slurring, overlapping. "You bury what you fear," it hissed. "You forget. I wait." Father Weiss spoke the final binding prayer. Matthias convulsed once, violently, then went limp. The distortion collapsed inward, drawn toward the bed, toward Matthias's chest. There was a sharp cracking sound, like stone breaking under pressure. Then silence. Emergency lights flickered back on. Matthias lay unconscious. His vitals stabilized slowly. The artifacts were reduced to fragments and dust. No resin remained. Father Weiss sat down heavily, exhausted. When Matthias awoke 2 days later, he remembered nothing after opening the crate. Psychological evaluations over the following weeks showed gradual improvement. The voices did not return. The nightmares faded. The artifacts were collected by the church and transferred to an undisclosed location. Official records state they were destroyed. Unofficially, that is disputed. Father Weiss died 6 months later. Cause of death was listed as heart failure. In his personal journal, found after his death, one final entry was underlined 3 times. Binding is not victory. It is delay. According to church archives, no similar artifacts have been reported since. But in 2019, during construction near the same stretch of the Tigris Basin, workers uncovered a stone slab carved with a familiar symbol. It was cracked, and it was warm to the touch.